This video is for The Living Earth, Unit 3.6, Mechanisms for Evolution. Today's essential question is, how does natural selection work? Darwin believed that organisms could change their appearance, structure, and behaviors through slow changes that occurred over many generations. What he needed was a mechanism to account for this. Darwin observed that much of the processes occurred when humans bred animals and plants. He called this method of producing new man-made varieties artificial selection, and he wondered whether a similar process could occur in nature. Artificial selection as a model. During the 18th and 19th centuries, many new plant and animal varieties had been bred through a process called selective breeding. Selective breeding involved taking individual plants or animals with desired traits and crossing them or breeding them. The resulting offspring would be selected for the same desired traits. This would usually take place over a number of generations until a new breed was produced. For example, plants that produced the juiciest berries might be purposefully cross-pollinated with another plant that was frost-resistant. Farmers understood that the resulting plants could produce juicy berries and also be resistant to low temperatures. Darwin recognized that this process was similar to what happens in nature, but the characteristics were selected by humans rather than by nature. Darwin argued that, for example, different types of sheep, like the ones shown on the screen here, found all around the world, may have had a common wild ancestor. He also crossed different breeds of pigeon to select a wide variety of forms. However, he noticed that the young often looked like the wild rock dove that lived on cliffs. He concluded that the rock dove was the common ancestor of the domestic pigeon. This supported his ideas about all organisms being descended through evolution from a common ancestor. Artificial selection provided Darwin with a useful model of how similar changes occurred in nature.
Traditional plant breeding relies on the controlled cross-pollination of related plant varieties to produce hybrid strains that end up with beneficial traits from each parent plant. Traits that plant breeders have sought to incorporate into our food plants have included things such as improved crop yields, increased tolerance to drought and heat, and resistance to harmful pests and diseases. Genetic crossing is typically achieved by collecting pollen grains from the anthers of one plant variety and manually applying them to the stigmas of another selected variety of the same species. This assures that one set of chromosomes from each parent plant will end up in the seeds of the hybrid offspring. When the seeds of the first hybrid generation are fully mature, they are collected and then are planted and raised. As the second generation matures, the hybrid plants are examined to identify those that express the desired traits. The best individuals are selected and are often repeatedly back-crossed with the parent plant to assure that the offspring they produce always exhibit the sought-after trait. With maize hybridization, that has often meant creating varieties that consistently produce large, nutrient-rich kernels. It is important to note that consistency in a hybrid strain is only possible when the sex cells it produces both possess the same beneficial gene, meaning that the plants are homozygous for that trait.
Natural selection. Darwin eventually came up with an explanation as to how this natural process, which he called natural selection, could occur. His explanation was based upon 4 observations. 1. All parents, regardless of species, can produce many more offspring than are needed to replace them. For example, An oak tree will produce hundreds of thousands of acorns during its lifespan. Each of these acorns has the potential to grow into a new oak tree. If this happened, then why is the surface of Earth not covered in oak trees? The same applies to animals, including people. What stops the populations of all organisms from growing out of control? Second observation, all organisms must interact with their environment in order to survive. For example, the availability of food, water, and shelter affect the individual's chance of survival. Their ability to avoid predators and disease are also important factors. Conditions in the environment affect an individual's chances of survival, and many are not successful. So, in any populations, many individuals do not survive long enough to reproduce. Third observation. With the exception of identical twins, all individuals of a species are different from one another. This is why we can tell people apart. The existence of these differences is called variation, although sometimes they look the same to us, and individual organisms, even of the same species, are in fact different. Some organisms have features or adaptations that better suit them for survival. Fourth observation. Many variations can be inherited. These variations can be structural or behavioral. For example, mice inherit the color of their fur, and some birds inherit their urge to migrate. Together, these four observations can account for how organisms changed over time. From these observations, Darwin realized that most organisms that are born fail to reproduce. Only those that have characteristics that help them to survive the struggle for existence can breed and pass on their characteristics to the next generation. Their offspring that have these characteristics are better fitted for survival. Although the differences between generations could be small, over time they could build up. The species would become better adapted to its environment, and it could even change into a new species. Darwin realized this process occurred everywhere in nature and named it natural selection. Darwin knew nothing about genetics or how new traits arise through mutation. Mendel's work on genetics did not come to light until after his death, and the discovery of DNA, genes, and how mutations occur was decades in the future. Today, scientists are less concerned about the survival of individuals. They think of natural selection in terms of the impact of differential reproductive success on the selection or loss of genes.
Although he's usually credited with developing the theory of evolution, it's more accurate to say that Charles Darwin introduced the theory of natural selection, the mechanism for evolution, in 1859. More than 20 years before, Darwin had set sail aboard the HMS Beagle to study the flora and fauna of South America, despite the fact that he was perpetually seasick.
Oh my.
Well into the 5-year study, Darwin reached the Galapagos Islands.
The natural history of this archipelago is very remarkable. It seems to be a little world within itself. The greater number of its inhabitants, both vegetable and animal, being found nowhere else.
Among the animals Darwin found were lots of birds, finches to be precise. He collected 13 varieties, all very much alike except for the size and shape of their beaks.
I came to the conclusion that all the finches were descended from one species.
Over a long period of time, the birds' beaks had changed. Each was adapted to the kind of food available in their local area. Seed eaters' beaks were different from insect eaters' beaks, and so on. From this and other observations, Darwin developed the theory of natural selection. Certain conditions must be met for natural selection to occur.
There must be a population of things that can make copies of themselves. The copying process must be imperfect, and the copying errors must lead to differences in the ability of the offspring to survive and make copies of themselves.
These copying errors may result in the offspring being better suited to their environment. Or perhaps not. But if the changed offspring are better able to survive, then that change will likely endure and spread throughout the population over generations. For example, there is a species of moth, Biston betullaria, but hardly anyone calls them that ranges in color from light to dark. A population of them lived in a birch forest. Light-colored moths blended with the tree bark, but darker ones stood out against the white birch bark. Birds ate more dark moths because they were easier to spot, leaving mostly light-colored moths to reproduce. Then came the Industrial Revolution, and with it, air pollution. The white birch bark turned sooty gray. Now the pale moths were more visible to birds, and the darker ones were camouflaged.
Oh no!
Birds began eating more pale-colored moths.
Wahoo!
In less than 100 years, the population of moths shifted from mostly pale to mostly dark.
In this example, it pays to be different. When natural selection favors a single trait, such as color, it's called directional selection.
Remember the Galapagos finches? During droughts, birds with strong, large, or very long bills were better equipped to survive. Those with average, medium bills were out of luck.
This is an example of disruptive selection. It pays to be a survivor with the right equipment.
But sometimes it pays to be average. The third distinct type of natural selection is called stabilizing selection, and it favors individuals that are the most like everyone else.
Over time, the most common traits are favored, and the extreme ones are reduced or even eliminated.
Today, the scientific evidence for evolution and natural selection underscores the complexity and beauty of biological design.
At this point, you should be able to generate a full and appropriate response to today's essential question. How does natural selection work?